Welcome to the code review of the backend database design. Here we have a snapshot in our README of what our database schema is. Our table is called users, and as you can see, each user has a unique ID, first name, last name, an email, a password, a unique URL associated with their account, whether or not they're an admin, a phone number, and a contact info. Here is our database provider and what our current database looks like. With limited space, we're only allowed up to 7 users, unfortunately. So if we select all from users, we can see all of our columns here and all the people who are registered currently. Hopping over to the code section, we have our user.js file, which is our main model to work with the Postgre database and connect, obviously. We use our security via a config file, a default.json file, which holds the database config. So at the top of our file here, we require Postgre, obviously, config for signup, and we have our db config variable here, which uses the config library to pull the details of signing into our database, which gives us admin privileges. So our first function is the lookup function, which is used for logging in. It takes an email and a password as well as a callback. And as you can see here, we connect to the database. Obviously, if we have any errors, we want to throw that back to the user immediately and return. Otherwise, we select the user's whole entire information from their email. First, we check to see if that email works. Otherwise, we would have an error. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. Now this error right here is if there's database connection error, followed by this check here. If results.length is equal to 0, that means there's no database, no user in the database underneath that email. Therefore, they do not exist. So that message would be flashed back and we return. Otherwise, we do have a user, and there should only be one of them, so it would be at index 0 of the result rows. We grab that row's password and check it against the password provided to us by the front-end user. If it's not equal, we call back with incorrect password, which will be the flash message, excuse me. Otherwise, we send back an undefined message showing that all has gone well with the whole entire user, which would be sent to the sessions user object. Following that, we have list, which is a function that queries all the database users. This is used for the admin homepage. This way they can see a list of users and passwords and things like that if necessary to see who else is an admin. This follows the same styling. We connect to the database. If there's some sort of database error, we throw that. Otherwise, we do the simple SQL connection here, query for selecting all users. These get packaged up, and what happens is we have a bunch of rows of users inside an object, and that gets pushed to the front end to be thrown into a table. And that sums up our list function. This could only be used from the admin home, obviously. Following that, we have our add function for when someone would like to sign up to our web app. You can ignore these comments. I have to remove those because the bug has been fixed since then. So what add does is it takes a user, which is an object defined by the front end by filling out a form with enough information to create a user, which would be all of the columns besides contact info. What we do is we connect and we first see if the email provided is already within the database. So we query for that email. If there's a database error, we call back. Otherwise, if the result rows is 0, that means an email does not exist inside the database under the provided one, thus it is okay to create this new user. We then call the query to insert this new user. Right here, done, we release all the clients back to the pool for standard Postgre protocol. If there's an error querying or inserting, we throw that right away in return. Otherwise, we do again our okay to go callback, which is an undefined first message so that the front end knows what's going on, and we also return that user for that session. Otherwise, we would have skipped over this, in which case rows.length doesn't equal 0, inferring that email already exists under a user that's been defined, and we call back with that email already exists with that email so that people can understand why they can't sign up. So that's about it. Update, search, and verify URL will be handled by our other backend engineer, Tyler.
Next we have the list function, which queries the database for all the users. This function is used to display all the user information on the admin home. So first you connect to the database. If there's an error, you return the error message, "Could not connect to database," and the error. Next we try to query the database by selecting everything from the users table. And then a callback function will return error or result. If it's an error, another callback function returns the error message, "Could not look up user accounts," and that error. If the user was not found in the table, there's a callback function with the error message, "No users were found in the database." Finally, if it was successful, returns undefined for an error and result.rows, which contains all the user information from the database. Next we have the search function, which takes a UURL, a unique URL, and a callback function. If a user is found based off the UURL, the user's first name, last name, and email is returned in order to render a user home page. So first you connect to the database, then you query, selecting the first name, last name, and email from the users. Release the client back to the pool. If there's an error, it's a callback function with the error message, "Could not properly query from the database," and that error. If the user was not found, it was because there was an invalid unique URL, which you send to this callback. Finally, you set var user to result.rows and return that in a callback, which contains all the user information. Finally, we have the verify URL function, which checks our database to see if an existing unique URL matches the UURL pass as a parameter. If it exists, the callback returns with a defined error message. Otherwise, it calls the callback with no error and an empty object. So you connect to the database, you query the database selecting the unique URL from the users, release the client back to the pool. If there's an error, you return the callback "could not properly query from database." If the user was found, that means a unique URL already exists for this user, so you return that unique URL in the callback. And finally, if not, you return the callback with an undefined error message and that unique URL.
Hi, this is Aaron. I am back. I'm here to show you some code. So my biggest contribution to Falcon Proj, or Found It as we like to call it, was the URL generator. So when you sign up for a new account, the thing that the website does to make sure that we know who you are and to make sure that people who find your stuff can find you is generates you a unique URL that is random and is inherently unique, because that's what I said it is. And it gets stored in the database and bound to your user object forever, as long as you exist in the database. So what I needed to do was I needed to write a URL generator, and the problem that kind of comes with that, but it just had to be thought about, was we need to make sure that the URL that we're generating is actually unique. So there were two parts to this. The first one was the generation. The second one was the checking of the uniqueness of it, so to speak. So I found a library called Chance, and I have links to it in the documents in the write-up, and you can go read about it if you want. But basically what Chance is it's just a node module that lets you generate random strings. So I figured that 5 characters was a good length for a random URL, short enough so that people can see it and not be like, whoa, and still be able to type it in easily, but long enough so that you have a good amount of combinations that are possible. And what we do is we declare a function called generateString that will return chance.string, which is a function on the Chance library, and I can give it a hash of options. So I give it a length of 5 to specify that we always want strings that are 5 characters long, and I gave it a pool of things because by default the library will just generate any valid character. I'm not sure if it's ASCII or if it obviously isn't some sort of Unicode, because we get emojis, but the problem that could become inherent with that is if you start generating things that could otherwise be query string characters like question marks and ampersands, you don't really want that. So I kept it to the lowercase alphabet and the numbers 0 through 9, just digits. So that should be simple enough. So the next thing I did was I created the generate URL export. So when a new user is created in the user roots /add, what the code there does is it calls this function, generate URL, that is exported from the URL generator module. So first we call generate string, which is the function that we defined up here that we just talked about, and it generates a URL. It may not be unique, but we're going to make sure about that. This is the main second part of the URL generator. So what happens is we have this Boolean variable, then while it is false to indicate that the URL is not unique, we call the verify URL export from user.js, I believe, that Andrew wrote and I helped him with. And verify URL takes a URL, which we have defined here, and it will call a callback function depending on what it gets back from the database. So if there's a problem, just forget it. Just get out. Otherwise, we assume that nothing's wrong, so set check equal to data, which should be the original string we pass into verify URL. And since in JavaScript a string is a truthy and something else that's like undefined or nil or not a number or whatever is a falsy, as long as data is a string, because we know enough about the verify URL function so that it's not going to return a different string, assuming check equals data, we set check equal to data. So check is now a string instead of false. But up here, this will return true because a string is a truthy. So we fall out and we return check, which is the string. So what this does, this is the entire URL generator. All it does is it generates a URL, checks it in the database, and then returns it to the calling function. The other main contribution that I gave was bug fixes, just because I thought the URL generator was going to be a lot more in-depth and involved, and it kind of wasn't. So I just sort of poked around the rest of the website. Everybody else had these huge modules and projects and libraries and things that they were working on, and they were running into a lot of problems. So that was sort of where I jumped in once I finished the URL generator. I helped with some database stuff. I helped with some handlebar stuff, and in functions like add and in especially update, there were a lot of problems that we were having with passing values between the handlebars views and this kind of code here. So I did a lot of debugging with request to the request objects and its various attributes, and I reorganized some callback functions and stuff like that and made things work that weren't working. So that's just about it.
Hello, Ben here to talk about the routes that I've implemented and how they interact with some of the handlebars files. So if you look at the app.js file, you will see the \route, which will redirect you to main home. From the main home route, if you are a user that is online and you have a user session, admin users will be redirected to the admin route, and non-admin users will be redirected to the user home route. If the user is not logged in, then we will render the main home page from which they can log in. Looking at the login route, if the user has a session and is online, we will redirect admin users to admin and redirect non-admin users to user home. If the user is not online, then we will render the login page, and from there they can log in. Looking at the login handlebars file associated with the login page, you will see that the form for the login page, as shown here, where you have a user enter an email and a password and a login button, when they click the login button, the auth path will be invoked. And that deals with authenticating a new user logging in. So if the user is online and it has a user session, then redirect admin users to admin and redirect non-admin users to user home. If they are not logged in, we will pull the email and password values from the form that the user entered to log in. And as long as both those values were entered correctly and filled in, then we will call the model.lookup function, which will verify that all the information that the user entered is correct with the database. And if everything is correct in this else case, we will add the user to the list of users online. We will create a session for that user and then redirect admin users to the admin route and redirect non-admin users to the user home route. The log out route will delete a user session, and if the user is online, then we will delete the user's email from the list of users that are online. After that is done, we will pass the successful logout flash message to the main home and redirect them back to main home. The about route deals with the about page. So if a user is not online or there is no user session, we will render the about page with the is logged in and is admin variables to false, which will prevent the logout button and the admin home button showing up from the about page. If the user is online, then we will also render the about page with the is logged in value to true, so that the logout button will show up, and if they're an admin, the admin home page will show up from the about page. Next is the sign-up route. This deals with the sign-up page, and it will simply grab the user session and render the sign-up page. From the sign-up page, if we look at the signup.handlebars file, there will be a form, and this correlates to the sign-up button and everything that somebody fills in to sign up. So when you type in all your information to sign up and you press sign up, it will invoke the add route. The add route is actually what adds the new user information to the database. So we will grab all the relevant information from the sign up form that the user entered, and we will set the admin automatically to no, because we do not want new users signing up to be admins. As long as everything is entered correctly, we will then use the URL generator to generate a new URL and call the model.add function to add a new user to the database with all the information that they entered into the sign-up form, as well as the URL created by the URL generator. And the model.add function will add that new user to the database. And then after that, if there are no errors, the user will be redirected to the login page. The user profile route will check if there is no user session or the user is not online. If so, the user will be redirected to the main home route. If the user session exists and the user is online, then we will call the model.search function to query the database depending on a user view URL and return relevant information to render the user profile page. And we will render the profile edit page, which is the user profile that will be rendered such that the user can change their contact information within that page. The user homepage does something pretty similar to the user profile page. If there is no user session, redirect back to main home. If there is a user session but the user is not online, redirect back to login. Otherwise, if the user is logged in, then we will render the user home page with the appropriate user information shown below. The admin route will check if the user is logged in and if the user session exists. So if the user is logged in but the user is not an admin, we want to redirect back to user home because they should not have access to the admin homepage. Otherwise, we will call the model.list function, which will query the database for all the information on users of Foundit. If there is no error querying the database, then we will render the admin homepage with the admin users information as well as the list of all other users of Foundit's information. And that is it for me.
So this is Lisa, the front-end designer of our web app. I used Bootstrap as well as my own CSS files to style our site. The layout of all of the styling is very straightforward. So starting with the main handlebars file, you can see that there's only a navigation bar and a footer because these are the only things staying consistent throughout the site. You can see as a theme throughout all of the handlebar files and their corresponding CSS files that a lot of them share. So for example, About and Team share a CSS file. So in the About file, you'll see that I have wrapped its content in an About div class, and in Team, similarly, I've wrapped it in a Team div class. This is so that when you go into the CSS file that they share, you can see which changes are being made for each page. So in this example, the only thing changing is the color. So you can see that I changed the background color in each div class to apply to only that page. This is common throughout all of the handlebars and CSS files, so it'll make it easier to tell which changes are being made where, especially with the labels that I've made. That will hopefully help you as well. So a few other pages that share login and sign up share a CSS file. Main applies only to the main layout, which is the navigation bar and the footer, so those will be applied to every single page. Main home is only for our landing page or our splash page, whatever you'd like to call it. That has its own because it's pretty different than the rest. Profile edit and user profile are very similar, but I did not give them the same CSS file because profile edit includes forms and tables that user profile doesn't. So if I were to put them in the same CSS file, it would have gotten very messy. So we kept those separate. And then user home and admin also share a CSS file as well. So that's how to navigate through those. I hope it's easy to follow and that you like our styling.
Hi, my name is Jared, and I worked on resolving issues between the dynamic routing, the database, and some of the handlebars files. First, we're going to take a look at some routes. This route is the dynamic route, which drives the ability to enter in findit.com/ and then simply the ID that you found on the object, or most likely the whole URL was written out on the object that way. So we can't, of course, hard code a route for every object because we don't even know how many there are going to be, and we're generating new IDs all the time. So taking a look at this route, we see that it has a colon in it as its first character after the slash. This is a special signal to Node to use dynamic routing, and thus this route has nothing to do with the actual literal string UUID. Instead, Node takes whatever comes after the slash and throws it into a field of the request object. So whatever you type in after is stored there, and we retrieve it with request.parameters.uuid, which stands for unique user ID, by the way. And then we search the database for it. If found, then we're going to render the user profile view, which is different than the user profile route. That's important and a little confusing, but there it is. And we give a message, we attach data that's been fetched from the database, and render the page that's going to help them return their item. If it's not found, we simply render 404. Since this dynamic route matches on any string typed after the slash and then searches the database for it, you might think that it would overwrite all other routes, that if you tried to type in /team, it would search the database, not find that, and render 404. It won't, because Node searches through where you've defined your routes to try to get a match in order from top to bottom. So it's important that this dynamic route come at the bottom of the file, behind all other routes. Any routes after it won't be matched, because once Node matches on a route, it doesn't search for others that would also match. But that also saves us here, because if it matches on one of the routes above it, it will never invoke this route. Now that we've talked about the dynamic routing, I want to jump over to userhome.handlebars, which helps us render a dashboard of all the places a user can go once they're logged into the site. And one of the places they can go is their page rendered by their unique URL to check their profile and see that it looks good. So since their page's URL is randomly generated and dynamically routed, it's not as straightforward as making a hyperlink to, say, a route called view my profile. Instead, Handlebars gave us a pretty elegant solution, which was to pass this user home route the URL in the JSON and have Handlebars fill it in within the href of this hyperlink. Handlebars provided an elegant solution to making this link on the user homepage go to the right URL, because we already knew what URL to direct to before the page finished loading, because it was stored in the user session. However, a button on the main page that redirects a user to a unique URL page if they only enter the unique URL in this field was more of a challenge, because on this page, Handlebars has already done everything it's going to do by the time the page loads. Then after the page loads, the button might be clicked. The button rendering is defined in the main home.handlebars file. And to solve the problem of redirecting based on the URL after the button is clicked, we used an HTTP GET request and a special route handler to handle an intermediate route between the main home route and the unique URL. Clicking that button will activate this form to submit a GET request to this route called /redirect to unique URL, and it will take the unique URL string out of the query string, and it will redirect the result. It will send a result that's a redirect to root plus that unique URL. Above the redirect to URL route handler, we've got the update route handler, which gives functionality to the button on the edit profile handlebars view that lets the user change their personal information. So let's take a look at profile edit handlebars first to get an idea of what's going on. We've got this form here, and when we render profile edit.handlebars, we actually pass it in JSON containing fname, lname, email, phone, and contact info that have been fetched from the database. And when we expose these text input fields for the user to edit how they like, we start them as filled in with the values the database currently has. This lets the user change information without having to retype anything, and also lets them submit the whole form at once without having to submit individual fields, because if they don't want to change anything, it's just there. So when you click the button, it's going to send an HTTP post request to the route update, and the update route, when it receives that, will get all those field values as part of the request body, and it will check to see that none of them are blank, because if any of them are, that will erase the value that used to be in the database, and we don't want that. And if they're all non-blank, then we can update the database using this model.update call, which I'll cover in a second. If there's an error, we basically just want to output it. It's probably some kind of database error, and it's going to dump them onto their user profile out of the edit screen. So then an important other thing to do is that, that's if there's an error. If there isn't an error, something important to do is to also if we've successfully updated the database, we also want to update the sessions user object, which we do here, and then we just give a flash message saying it was successful, and take them back to their dashboard. So the update route does the bulk of its work by calling the model.update function, which is defined over here in user.js, and all it does is connect to the database. It takes in all those values, it connects to the database, and it sends in this query, and it's gonna set the values for fname, lname, phone, contact info. We search the database by emails, so currently we do not support changing users' email. So yeah, if it has some sort of problem with the database, returns relevant error message. And that's all there is for the update function.